69 years ago, the Fellowship of the Ring gave fans their first look at the mines of Moria, a massive system of caves and cities that had all been run down and destroyed by the Balrog that took over the area. In the 2001 film of the same name, John Rhys Davies portrayed the character Gimli, son of Gloin, in leading the Fellowship through the mines of Moria toward Mordor to complete the quest of the Council of Elrond and destroy the One Ring in the fires of the volcano. Now, 22 years since the Oscar award-winning films graced the silver screen, it's time to return to Moria. In a world wrought with survival games and shovelware, pun absolutely intended, it's hard to live up to the greats. Valheim, Minecraft, V Rising, and many, many more. But with the backing of the legendary Middle-earth universe, we yearn for the mines again. I've played so many of these games over the years, hunting for materials, surviving waves of combat and boss battles, building my dream home that I could never afford in the economical realities of the world. It really is the definition of survival fantasy. With seemingly no real marketing strategy, and after the absolute failure of the last licensed Lord of the Rings game, Gollum, can the mines of Moria rekindle the forges left cold so long ago? Or are the dangers of Tolkien's universe, and our own gaming industry, too much for the old stones to bear? Grab your pickaxe and delve into the depths again in the Lord of the Rings Return to Moria's loop. The gameplay of Return to Moria is about what should be expected in a game of this genre. You fight some things, you explore some things, you mine and collect some things, and you get bigger and bigger and stronger the more you play until you hit the end. The end is usually where these games fall apart. There is no payoff. There is no end. You just go back to doing what you were doing with less to worry about. The end of many of these games is where you finally get to just play creative mode because there is no lack of materials and no actual threats to you. The threats of Moria, however, and its systems in general, lead you to a slightly different style of gameplay that honestly felt a bit clunky to me compared to its contemporaries. The combat felt sluggish, and at many times like it was an afterthought to the rest of the game, but the rest of the game didn't feel fleshed out enough to feel any better. There are 4 types of combat in this game to deal with, and some of them feel really out of place comparatively. These types of combat are further augmented by the enemies that you're fighting as well. Many different types of enemies live in the mines, and most of them fight in a way that makes sense. There are some issues here and there with how they interact with their environments and the player, but overall the enemies themselves present a good challenge, as well as a diverse list of combat mechanics to watch out for. Wild animals and beasts roam many parts of the mines, from rats to goats and deer to wargs, and even bears. The regular fauna of Moria is diverse, and all are needed for different versions of collecting and crafting. The more fantasy-type creatures, drakes, nameless beasts, fell beasts, trolls, goblins, orcs, and of course uruks, all run rampant throughout the depths of Moria and in different locales and progression points. Some, like the orcs and uruks, even have special areas in each part of the game to work through and claim treasures from, like a dungeon in a dungeon. There are even bosses scattered throughout the mines in many different locations that cause massive waves of enemies to come pouring out of the woodwork to attack you. The first type of combat you will encounter here are the random enemies that spawn in patrol areas of the map. Usually these groups are not that bad to deal with. It can get dicey though, entering new areas and power curves become pretty wild. When the new types of enemies are introduced, there is a change as well in what enemies are present and what fighting styles and weapons work best. Second are sieges. You'll get a notification that a siege is happening at one of your bases throughout the mines. Usually it's the one most recently inhabited, but any base on the current level of the player is up for battle at any time. Sieges are smaller waves of enemies attempting to destroy your base and set you back a bit, but usually are not too bad. They can overwhelm you though, so be aware as you're setting up a base to have a few gates to work back through as needed. Type number 3 is a horde. Much like the drums from the deep in the Fellowship of the Ring, goblins, orcs, uruks, trolls, bats, and even more will swarm on you, and your only option is to fight back. These can be a particular challenge as more and more types of enemies are introduced and begin to cause more issues to the player throughout their quest to reclaim Moria. Last are bosses, and the bosses in this game need some work. There are 3 that you come across in your time in Moria, and all of them have differences mechanically that stand out in comparison to the rest of the game, but none of them in particular is a challenge. That could be partly due to the simple combat system in general, but once you figure out the gimmick, they become jokes very quickly. Exploration and Return to Moria is probably one of the best parts of this game. Though the maps have some repetition and you see many of the same set pieces throughout the game, the atmospheric changes and not knowing what monsters or surprises could be lurking around the next corner give a sense of adventure that even V Rising and Minecraft don't compete with in my opinion. Finding out that trolls turn to stone in sunlight, which any Tolkien fan should know anyway, was a super interesting find. Seeing your first uruks, fighting your way through an orc camp, Stumbling into a drake nest and finding set pieces from the Lord of the Rings lore are all fantastic additions to the exploration that really set this game apart from others. Would they be as exciting if they weren't franchise specific? Maybe, but seeing and hearing so many familiar scenes really put this game in a different league than others of the genre. That isn't to say a better league, but we haven't really seen a game like this in a licensed IP before. There are a handful of different zones throughout the mines of Moria to explore, and all of them have their own special places to find and explore as well. From the western halls in the Elven Quarter to the abandoned city in Dwerodelf and the Tomb of Kings in the lower deeps, there are many places to find that stand out from the rest of the caves you find yourself in for most of the game. Even finding Balin's Seat, the room from the famous Moria scene in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, was a nice set piece to find and pray that a horde didn't spawn in the moment like it did in the film. Some of the best parts of exploring are finding the set pieces and experiencing the story. There is something to be said about a story in a game like this and progression in general. Finding a grand room and having a dialogue moment of lore is a nice touch to add to the game as a whole. The exploration overall was a good time, but like I said before, there were many reused assets and rooms that did get a bit tedious after a while. Waiting for that next big set piece was what fueled a lot of the adventure for me. The second part of any good survival crafter, or the first part for some very specific types of people, is the crafting system. Crafting in Return to Moria is simple at first, but gets a bit complicated and clunky as time goes on. With so many things to keep track of, and in some cases only one small place to get certain materials, it becomes required to take frequent trips to these areas to get materials, as spawn rates tend to be lower as well. Some of the crafting benches and items don't have a lot of utility anyway and feel more like a time gate than an actual useful step in the process. There are some cosmetic changes to some items and overall size changes as you grow up the chain as well. Some items can only be made at world forges scattered throughout the mines. These particular forges have a small list of items that can be made at them using specific materials. Some items you make are needed for a specific part of the story and really never used again. Their materials are, but they don't really give a big bonus to anything that you don't already have. In most cases, generic items will work just fine for you, like food and brews, but the need for higher end versions at times feels completely arbitrary to their use case and are just plain expensive, even in the endgame. One notable exception to this rule is the final weapon of the game. It's said that it is needed to fight the final boss, but the boss goes down so easily that it's almost irrelevant. However, it is by far the best weapon in the game to fight off regular enemies, so your mileage may vary based on your endgame goals. Armor in this game is a fine system. Like many other games in the genre, it gives you an extra window of damage outside of your health pool that allows you to stay in combat longer to fight off enemies. The problems here though are that sometimes the armor just doesn't work. Whether or not it's a bug or intended is hard to discern and isn't described anywhere in the game. The armor itself looks cool, and when it works, it really works. Crafting the armor and many other recipes requires that you rebuild statues throughout the mines, or unlock chests or collectible tables to get upgrades. Every time you enter a new zone, you begin to get recipes for a new armor set, except for the last one where it's more of a continuation with a slightly harder difficulty curve to the zone before it. One of the biggest parts of any survival crafter is the base building and general operation of the player housing. There are some common themes here: housing structures, crafting structures, food, customization, different materials and strength, and so on. There really is never a good place to set up a base though. Many times, my party just commandeered a building that was already standing and set up new doors and walkways around them to protect them from enemies. That is, until enemies started to spawn in our base, and there was nothing we could really do to stop them from doing so. The building system itself is clunky as well, with many things not snapping correctly or not working the way they should, and the almost grid system that the game runs on sometimes just breaking itself and not being aligned with what you were trying to build. It was frustrating, but manageable overall, and we still managed to complete the game. Crafting and building are huge parts of a survival crafter, and this one just left a lot to be desired. Though some things were fixed in patches after launch, and it doesn't seem like the devs are just giving up on the game and the bugs as a whole. As I said before, the story of this game is one of the things that sets it apart from other games in this genre. John Rhys-Davies reprises his role as Gimli, son of Gloin, after the events of The Lord of the Rings, on a mission to reclaim the ancestral dwarven mines of Moria. Knowing that Balin failed and having seen firsthand the desolation of the ancient dwarven home, his quest is to clear it out and bring it back to its former glory. Through a turn of events, the player is stuck in the mines with no way out and no way for anyone to come help, and it's up to them to traverse the mines and fight their way through to defeat the corruption locking them in and everyone else out. Dark magics and curses are holding down the fort along with orcs, trolls, and a dragon claiming the mines as home. You meet a bird named Eric, who is your forerunner and go-between for Gimli and the player character, guiding you to doorways that may be open but never are, and filling you in on as much information as it can find along the way. You stumble through many parts of the mines that have not been touched by dwarven hands in decades, if not longer, and find signs from Gandalf during his travels through the mines with the Fellowship, all leading to the exit that the Fellowship took, the bridge that was destroyed by the Balrog and Gandalf during their battle. But the Balrog was defeated, so what evil magic still hold the mines? The dragon, Narag Shazan, the broodmother of the Nazgul's mounts, tortured by Sauron and corrupted by his magic, has taken refuge in the mines and has laid claim to its spoils, corrupting the mines with dark magic and shadow. It is up to the players to defeat this dragon and cleanse the mines of her magic, as well as the Watcher in the Water and the orcs that have set up dens of their own and don't exactly like visitors. Once you complete the purge and exit the mines, Gimli is there to welcome you back and thank you for all the work you've done in reclaiming what was the ancestral home of the dwarves. There are a lot of differences between this game and other games in this genre that have been released over the last few years. The biggest one, in my opinion, is that it is a complete game. There are still bugs and issues, sure, but a complete story with all the accoutrement that led to a true ending. One of the biggest problems in the genre is starting games in early access and slowly over the course of many years, giving piecemeal next steps that tend to be larger than many settings and encounters in the game already. It feels like jumping into a full new expansion partway through a game in many cases. Take Valheim, for example. The game launched with some of the zones, but not all of them, and if you traveled to any of the incomplete zones, there was just nothing there. Maybe a spooky ground effect, but it took a few years before that next zone was released and it's still not complete. Now they are actively updating and working on completing the game, but it's still incomplete overall. Same goes for V Rising, where there has been a zone on the map since it was released to the public that is inaccessible even after Gloomrot was released and completely shook up the map as a whole. That's not to say that these games are broken or unplayable, it's not often we get a complete game in this genre from the jump. The addition of a true narrative in this game as well is a stark difference to others of the genre. There's usually a loose story buried in the game like The Forest or V Rising, but it's never been the main driving force. It's more of a find something and get a piece of the setting. Return to Moria starts with a story beat, and while it does get lost at times, drives the story home at the end. The building system of this game is not nearly as robust or even as effective as V Rising, Valheim, Minecraft, or many other games of the genre. It's clunky and needs a real overhaul. Maybe with some more understanding or defined points of how and where to build. Is the idea to build a bunch of little camps and a main base or a main base on every floor? The only place that really jumped out to me as you should build here ended up giving my party more of an issue than a solution, and it's never really explained what prevents enemies from spawning in your base as opposed to outside it. In Valheim, it's the workbench. In V Rising, it's player-laid borders. In Minecraft, it's light and player-laid tiles. In Return to Moria, we tried all of that, and none of it helped in our largest base. Now, this could have just been a bug, but it was frustrating when getting attacked by a horde or a siege and not being able to run to safety to regain health and buffs or even fix gear. The crafting system feels a bit out of sorts, and like it could use some refinement as well. V Rising and Valheim both had issues with this as well in their early days and were refined to be better with time. I assume something like that will happen in a future update to Return to Moria as well, but for now, some of the development of items and materials just feels out of sorts and like there is no real point to use it when you get it. There don't seem to be many real incentives or need for a lot of items to be built, so you can just skip them overall. Maybe it's meant to be an aesthetic-based building thing, like many players use Valheim for, but this game doesn't have the building system or even the overall aesthetics to make that feel good. I've already commented on some of the issues I've had with this game, but I think there's some more details that really need to be explored here. For starters, the lack of dedicated server support, even self-hosted, was a big letdown for my party and I. We usually rent out or host a server for people to log into whenever, if they want to do a little gathering or crafting or what have you. That really isn't an option here, and especially with the previously mentioned lack of locations to find certain items, it became a bit of a pain to spend our time out looking for previous resources and not progressing further in the mines. On top of that, connection and performance issues were another major problem, as many times things would just become uninteractable for anyone that wasn't the host. Items would disappear, tables would just stop working, and crafting would say that the materials didn't exist. There would be loading walls that would prevent people from running away from danger or going to help a friend. All of our connections are very strong. None of us is playing on a light internet setup, but we still ran into issues connecting to the host. Speaking of connecting, one of our party members just couldn't launch the game. We have the exact same spec computer, and it ran for me with streaming mostly fine, but would hang while trying to launch for him every time. No amount of reinstall or settings changes would fix the issue, and ultimately, they just refunded the game. Additional issues with the actual gameplay made themselves known as well. On occasion, your armor just wouldn't work, for one reason or another. Even if it was fully fixed and you had all of your armor bars, You just took damage to the face and died when fighting enemies. The bosses were mostly a joke, and it was more of a challenge to fight off regular enemies than it was to fight bosses. The last boss in particular took all of 3 swings before dying. The third act in general felt rushed and a little less complete than the rest of the game, which made the ultimate payoff feel a bit hollow. The time between moving forward in the third act felt strangely long between beats, with big gaps between events, leading to a hollow end and a good story close, but not great closure with the game overall. None of these issues made the game unplayable, but it felt like it was just kind of bland. The bones were good, but combat was mediocre. The building was broken and confusing, the crafting was iffy at best, and the story was good until the actual game got in the way of that story. After all of that, I really did have fun with this game. There were a lot of annoying issues and bugs. There were plenty of times where we had to restart our game session. There were performance issues that should never have existed, and there were plenty of letdowns and uneven damage curves. Survival crafters are mostly meant to be a vehicle for fun with a group, and this game achieved that, but it was a little touch and go at times, dealing with the issues and not being able to play with our full group overall, since it wouldn't even launch. Is it the shining example of a game of this genre? No. But is it the kind of complete package shakeup that I would like to see more of? Yes. Waiting years on end to sink another 100+ hours into a run of a survival game isn't as fun as that first run, and sometimes that new content loses its luster quicker than getting to even play the content took in the first place. I put probably about 300 to 500 hours a year into games of this genre, and as it sits now, I don't know that I would go back as this game is complete. Could they do a DLC or a sequel? Sure, and I would absolutely come back for that. Will I come back after some bug fixes and a patch or two? No. The vehicle for fun definition of this genre is kind of a staple at this point, and this game does hit it, but it's a moped in a world of performance cars.